I want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to the Seminary of the Southwest. We're delighted and honored to be able to host the Monday Connection here at the seminary. Our students are all on fall break, which is why this dining room doesn't have students in it right now. And we're happy that 3 times a year we invite members of the wider community to this space to have conversations around theology, business, and daily life. Our school, as you know, was founded to train Episcopal clergy, and since its founding days, it has done that. And in addition, we have a thriving counseling program, Master of Arts in Mental Health Counseling, where students attend on weekends and evenings, and that program was actually the brainchild. One of its founders was Will Spong. So we have him to thank for that thriving program. We also have a curriculum called the Iona Initiative that is taught to bivocational priests and deacons in 18 dioceses around the country. So those are the 3 areas for our degree and certificate programs. And I encourage all of you to come to our public events. There's a card at your tables, and join us for chapel. We have chapel 3 times a day, and we welcome all. And it's just wonderful to be able to have you come at any time to meet our students and to see what we do. So we're very, very happy to have you here. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Cynthia Kittredge. I stand up here so often, I forget to do that. I'm the dean and president, and I've been here since 1999 when I came from Massachusetts to be on the faculty. And before I introduce the Monday Connection host, I want to say how honored I am to have John Spong here as a speaker today. His father, Will Spong, was a close colleague and a beloved mentor of mine until his death in 2004. And when my father died in 2000, Will told me, your relationship with your father never ends, even when he dies. And I imagine that's the case for John and all of you. So it's particularly wonderful to have John and his family here today. But now I want to introduce Tom McCourse from the Monday Connection Steering Committee to introduce our speaker.
Well, according to the program, I have 1 minute to introduce John Spong, so you can see how that works. Seriously, it's with great anticipation that we welcome John Spong to our speaker on Monday Connection. I believe, John, this is a record crowd, so either your magnetism as a personal writer, or I won't go into that. But anyway, we're delighted that you're here. John earned his bachelor's and a law degree from the University of Texas, and after that fairly upscale education, he continued the family pedigree of unpredictability by going to work for Texas Monthly as a fact checker. Seriously, he has now risen to a senior editor, so that makes it helpful. John is married to Julie Blacksley, and they have 2 children of elementary school age, I believe, or younger. Toddlers, my apologies, and sympathy. Equally impressive, in addition to having married very well, is the breadth of John's interest and magazine writing. As you saw on the information that was sent out, he has been listed as a special an award winner. That's the easiest way to say it. And books called Books on Food. And then a couple of years later, books on sports writing. He has written an article, and maybe more to come, about an activity of, shall we call it, censorship over a gift at St. Andrew's School. But he's also been embedded with U.S. troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. if you Google John Spong, be careful because you're liable to run across Professor Will Spong and Bishop John Spong as mixed in equally well. They don't seem to get your name straight, but for obvious reasons that's important. But at any rate, Dean, I would like to make you aware of a fact you're only partly aware of. I proposed to you that John was actually the youngest scholar at this seminary. Beginning his studies here in the magazine section of the library at under age 6, and I'll let him elaborate if he chooses to on that. There will be some time for questions afterward, but may with great joy I present John Spong.
What all will I destroy if I spill this? Maybe I'll put it back down. It is a real honor to be here. Get this up a little. Something like that. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks for those nice introductions and thanks for inviting me. This place meant so much to my dad in his life, and I feel like he meant a lot to it. And so to get to be here where he was, where his adult life was spent, is really an honor, and I appreciate it. And I was glad to hear the kinds of things that y'all said, because there was this kind of threshold question I felt like I had to ask, which was, do most of y'all know who Will Spong was? Is that a name that means something to most of you? That will make a real difference as we go through. That cuts out a lot of other things I might have to get into. But the nutshell is he was an Episcopalian priest. He was a professor of pastoral theology here for, I think, 30 years, from 1972 to 2002. He was a nationally regarded grief and crisis counselor, and he was my dad. But so the place to start then, I think, is to point out, to suggest that being the son of a clergyman is kind of like being the son of a professional wrestler. Not exactly, but kind of. And so you may not know this, but pro wrestling is a family business. It's passed on from fathers to sons, and it always kind of has been. And part of the reason for that is that back in the old days, before wrestling kind of gave up the lie that it's a sport, when now they acknowledge that it's just an entertainment. Back then, when people thought it was a true sport, wrestlers could never let down the act. They could never act like they weren't that. When they got around non-wrestlers, they had to stay in character. Their sons, on the other hand, got to see behind the curtain. The sons there was a demystification that took place. Now, I don't mean to suggest in any of that when my dad was in the pulpit, he was acting or he was saying things that he didn't believe. But he did do a good job with me and my brothers of letting us know that there were things in the service to take literally, and there are other things you maybe didn't need to. And an example there for me would be when my youngest son, Willie, who's 2 now, 2.5, was baptized a couple years ago. There was a moment during the ceremony where we renounced Satan. I don't want to offend anybody in the room, but I will confess I've not devoted a lot of energy in my life to worrying about Satan. My dad was always pretty clear when we talked about that he thought the idea that there might be a Satan running around tempting people to do bad things was more useful as a way to understand, is more useful as an excuse for people to escape responsibility for their own behavior than as a way to understand how the world actually works. Still, the liturgy required Dad to talk about Satan now and again, and it had never occurred to me that that was anything less than genuine. It was another part of the pageantry of an Episcopalian church, like the stained glass and the incense and the organ and the vestments. And so then the vestments, they're so formal. I don't know if this is the intention or not, but there is this. They create this bright line distinction between the people in the church and the priests. When I'm a kid sitting in church, they're not doing that for me because I'm looking at my dad. And then additionally, my dad's vestments were different. He had a stole that had Kermit the Frog on the bottom of the stole. Now, people that knew my dad well knew that that was because one of his greatest hit sermons was built around Kermit the Frog's theme song, It Ain't Easy Being Green. But for me, as a kid, when Sesame Street is my babysitter for 30 minutes a day, Kermit the Frog is a real figure. And I used to sit at the piano with my dad all the time while he played that song. So when he puts those vestments on, that's not a divide between me and him. That's something that makes what's happening in the church all that more personal for me. And then there's the church itself. This is probably overstated, but I think that for a lot of people, church and faith are synonymous or intricately intertwined. For a lot of people, I think the word church brings automatic reverence. It was not always that way at our house. The church was my dad's boss. And when a lot of people get home from work, they might complain about the boss. And my dad did that. When I was a kid, I thought that that meant he must be some kind of radical rebel or something like that. I got older, I learned more about his life story, and I came to understand it differently. And it was in part that when he was coming up, he saw the church do some things that he thought were indefensible, chiefly in the civil rights movement, and the way congregations and givers, vestrymen in the churches in the South were trying to put limits on where their money went when they gave it to the church because they wanted to keep it locally, they said, which sounds neutral and reasonable. They didn't want it going to the national church because the national church was giving money to Malcolm X University and things like that. When bishops did not stand up to those local churches, my dad couldn't get it. The way the church treated gay people for a long time was part of that too. My dad couldn't abide that stuff. But so if these things that are kind of sacred for a lot of people don't necessarily mean that for a preacher's kid, what's left? And that's where I would say that this kind of dovetails a little better with what the Monday Connection is about. As I understand it, it's nominally a discussion about how to take the lessons of Sunday and live them through the week. Let me suggest that one of the particularly cool things about being a preacher's kid is that those faith lessons aren't restricted to Sundays, and they're not always even couched in the language explicitly of faith. There was one of my favorite lines that my dad used. It's in the magazine story that I wrote about him. He used it often enough to where I don't have to give the same origin story for it. I can tell you now that when I was in the 5th grade, my dad took the family to see Rocky, and everybody probably saw Rocky. Young fighter is plucked from obscurity to have a title fight, and then he trains through meager means, and somehow he fights better than anybody expects. And then at the end of the movie, he loses. And so I'm a 5th grader, and I was like, Dad, why in the world has this movie been made about the guy who lost? And my dad said, no, son, the losers are always more interesting than the winners. And so I'm a kid, and that stuck with me, in part because my dad said it, in part also because I thought there was this kind of cynical, contrarian tone to it that really appealed to me for most of my life. But once I really thought about it, I saw it as this kind of great distillation of the faith that my dad had given me. And in the context of the movie, or the quote explicitly, it goes like this: "The world is a broken place. We all lose a whole lot more often than we win. A story about someone who wins is a story about someone who got exactly what they wanted. We don't learn that much from that. A story about the guy who lost, on the other hand, the guy who lost did not get what he wanted. So ultimately, if their effort was indeed worth their while, then they must have played the game or fought the fight for some other reason. They got something else out of it. And to try and think about what that something else was is a little bit more interesting. To put that explicitly into a discussion of faith, start with the same premise. The world is a broken place. And if we go to God looking for an all-powerful being who can make things perfect, who can, might, or will give us exactly what we want, much of the time we're going to get disappointed. And if we get disappointed with God, that can get really complicated. So if we suffer some disappointment, when we suffer disappointment, I mean the real kind, like a sudden death of someone we love, we can begin to heal a whole lot faster if we can start with the premise that that's just what happens. The world is a broken place. The Lazarus story is a great place for this preacher's kid to go there. Dad talked about that with me some. And the lesson of that story, as I understood it from him, was not that Jesus had brought Lazarus back to life, whether that's historically accurate or, as Dad often suggested, a metaphor for being born again in Christ. Dad focused on the thing that Jesus does in that story that we can actually do, that we're capable of. Namely, when he gets to Mary and Martha in front of the tomb and he learns that Lazarus has died, he weeps. We can do that. We can care. We can love. Dad never suggested that that is easy, but it's honest, and it undoes a lot of the damage that sugarcoating can do. And I always thought that for my dad, pushing his seminary students and his counseling clients to be honest with themselves about life was the prime goal. It's actually my favorite sentence that I wrote in the story. I never heard him say it, but I feel like he would have signed off on it. In Dad's view, confronting the harsh realities of life is a non-negotiable obligation of a life of faith. There are other things that Dad said that I started to finally understand a little better in this context of faith when I was working on the story. Dad spent a lot of time just being a parent with my brothers and me, and that was a lot of instruction like you need to be kind, you need to be humble, you need to save judgment. It's not our job to judge people. I did just kind of understand that in the context of that's what dads tell sons, and hopefully sons listen. Jane Lewis was one of the people I talked to for the story about my dad. She was a former student and then a colleague of his. She kind of gave me a deeper understanding of that. She reminded me of something else I heard Dad say often. There is nothing in human history that anyone has ever done that we are not all capable of. And what that means is that there's a little bit of Jesus Christ in all of us, but also a little bit of Hitler. Now, I always loved that line. I heard my dad use that a few times, and I loved it, especially because the shock value and the looks on faces at the adult Sunday school at St. David's when he threw something like that out was nice. Jane helped me to really get it, though. She says, if you incorporate that into your core understanding of what it means to be human, then you can see the entire spectrum, not just in yourself, but in others. And then you don't have to be afraid of them. And I would add that it also prevents you from judging them. It dovetailed perfectly with something another student of Dad's, my friend Pittman McGehee, Pittman the Younger, told me. He said that one of Dad's basic beliefs was that we are the sacrament. When Pittman said that to me, it made no more sense to me than when my dad used to say the same thing. But then in the seminary library, which is a very important place to me, I did find a video of Dad, and he was being interviewed by some students. This was after he had retired. And in that interview, he says this: we spend a lot of time in the church talking about how our sacraments are communion, baptism, confirmation, marriage, and burials. But you see, I think we need to figure out that we are the sacrament. We are the outward and visible sign of the inward and spiritual grace of God in the world. Now, if you'll hold that thought and bear with me just a little longer, I can explain better how I came to understand that. When I was a kid, I was between 6, 12, maybe 15, I came to the seminary a lot. Both my parents worked, and on weekends and on weekdays during the summer, back before my brothers and I were old enough to stay home alone, Dad would bring us up here, and he'd turn us loose on the seminary campus while he met with clients. We had a blast. Look at how beautiful these grounds are. We would climb trees. We would chase each other through the breezeways. There was a student's lounge where we could play pool. It had a Coke machine. We had Cokes. It was nice. We'd go to the library. We would terrorize the Boers, which we thought was big fun. And I'll confess that I had no earthly idea what my dad was doing back in his office. Grading papers, doing CPE evaluations, counseling clients. I had no concept of what any of that could be. What he was doing is using the faith that I just kind of sloppily outlined to help pull people through the most difficult experiences of their lives. I could see hints at that, not that they always registered, but there were things like song lyrics on banners and notes in his office that said things like, life is what you do while you're waiting to die, or a heart without hurt is hollow. It pointed me in the right direction. I wasn't quite getting it, and I certainly didn't understand how knowing that was going to help someone whose marriage had just failed or whose child was an addict, or somebody who had just been diagnosed with AIDS and now had to figure out how to tell their parents they were gay because they hadn't been able to before. I knew, though, that it was important. when I would go out with Dad, when we would go to Horns games or we'd go to the store or Mr. Gaddy's, people would come up and I could always tell who was a client because there was a connection there and there was an appreciation and it was profound. And when Dad died, I got this flood of emails from people saying, your dad saved my life. Your dad kept me alive after this happened or this happened or this happened. I knew how important that was. I didn't fully get it, though, until one day, a couple Novembers ago, I was in the checkout line at Whole Foods. The clerk, whose line I'd been through before, we had talked. I don't really know her. She's a cartoonist. She's a cool woman. But she just said out of nowhere, I never met your father, but I've heard about him, and I've heard that if you lost a child in Austin, Texas, Will Spong was the person you went and talked to. So she said that, and I looked down, and there's Willie. He's my 4-month-old son. I thought, wow, that is such a great thing for him to hear and for me to hear too. And suddenly I had this different understanding of what my dad was doing for people. I always knew it was the most painful thing you could experience. But it's a little different now that I've had those weird nights when the monitor is too quiet and I sneak into Willie's room to make sure he's still breathing. The idea that my dad could help people in such instances is as hard for me to imagine as the pain that those people must feel. But having Willie, and now his younger brother Leon, has helped me understand my father in an even deeper way. Because it was only after holding those two boys that I truly understood how much my father loved me. And that love I will offer is perfect. My relationship with my father was not perfect. We let each other down. We ticked each other off. We hurt each other's feelings, occasionally on purpose. But we forgave each other. And we struggled together to try and make sense of the world. And we took songs to each other that we thought the other one might dig. And so, to my mind, the relationship wasn't perfect, but the love was. And so if you were to ask where God is in all this, I'll answer right there. Because when I sit in Dad's rocker trying to get Willie or Leon to sleep, and I sing Alfie to them, the look they give back and the feeling that comes over me is, without question, an outward and visible sign of the inward and spiritual grace of God in the world. And so that's what I got. And if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them. And if not, we can go back to the carrot cake. Yes, sir.
At what point did you start to appreciate your dad? It's the classic story, and obviously I have 3 sons, and that has some influence on my question.
Well, so that's it. The comments like the losers are always more interesting than the winners. As I say, when I was a kid, that made my head swim. And, you know, my dad, we grew up in Westlake, and not to knock Westlake, but, you know, if you're cool in Westlake, it's because you're a football player and because your dad might be the Little League football coach, and that wasn't my dad, you know. One of the ways I always think of it is my dad wore saddle shoes. Literally, that was not cool. And I was 6th, 7th grade, when you were at the most insecure time in your life, people would make fun of me because my dad had saddle shoes. And I could always say, he's a priest. You know. And so then, though, as I got older, as I saw friends' parents who went to my dad for counseling talk about the changes, the ways he had helped them. And then when I saw friends go to my dad for counseling and talk about the way he helped him. When I was a kid, you go to see your dad preach, and everybody tells him he's wonderful at the end, and they come and meet you, and they tell you you're wonderful because you're with him. But it feels good. But as you get older and you can start to understand the things he's saying, then you start realizing, wow, this has all been about something, and it's actually kind of cool, and it starts to run a little bit deeper.
John, can you say something about music?
When I've still got vinyl albums that I took from my dad when he started packing up his vinyl, and they are albums that we listened to together when we were kids. It's everything from Streisand and Sinatra to Stevie Wonder. When he preached so often, it was one of the things that I always really enjoyed about listening to him preach, because he went to non-traditional sources. He went to secular sources for a lot of these faith messages. And when he's talking about a Harry Chapin song, or the best example is the Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. When he talked about all that, when he got these really heavy-duty messages out of that, everybody I talked to about him, there were a lot of things that everybody said over and over. And one was, there was one of his greatest hit sermons about Rodgers and Hammerstein, and he was, I think, talking about South Pacific, and there's a song in there where it's, you must be carefully taught. It's about how teaching kids to hate. And so when Dad's playing the piano, and it's kind of fun, and everybody's singing along, they're doing this, and then you just realize all these people are singing some very kind of hateful things, and they catch themselves, and they realize, oh, wow, I've subversively just kind of been taught this thing. There was the way my dad taught with music that I really appreciated, and it really made me look at music differently. When I listened to it, I try to find something a little deeper. But then there was also the shared experience of listening to something together. And so that's why I say I sit in the rocker and sing Alfie to my kids. That was one of the songs that Dad used in his teaching so effectively. And I can't get through it. There's that line, I believe in love, Alfie. And every time something comes over me. Yes, ma'am.
What kind of relationship did your dad and his brother have, or do you remember about that?
Yeah, well, it's complicated because, and so some of the people that knew my dad well got that. The easy way I always thought of it was that they were kind of doing the same thing, but Uncle Jack was doing it on TV, which is overgeneralized, but it kind of gets at it. Jack is this guy that brings when he walks into a room, the attention goes there, and that's not what Dad did, and so I'm sure there was a sibling rivalry in effect in some ways. I'm sure that it's an older brother and a younger brother, but with that, the way I always understood it is Jack spent his life working to try to do things like get the church to accept gay people and getting culture, the world at large, to accept gay people. And Dad worked to get moms and dads to accept gay sons. I never once heard, when we talked about stuff that's in the Bible, the stuff Dad said was not that different from the stuff that Jack writes. Dad just didn't feel like he needed everybody to hear it in his voice, And so, and Dad, literally, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with this is Dad would say all the time, I don't know. If somebody believed differently from Dad, he would not tell them they were wrong, because he didn't know. It's like, is there a heaven or not? Dad would be like, I'm not real sure. If I spend my energy worrying about that, I'm not doing a good job while I'm here. Let me try and do a better job here. And so I think that in a lot of ways they believe the same things, and I thought they were trying to accomplish the same stuff, but Dad was more concerned about the clients that were coming in an hour than the bigger picture like that. I think that's right. Yes, sir.
John, I heard your dad give his Sunday school lessons with piano songs on several occasions. They were always wonderful. I wonder if anybody ever taped, or are there any video copies of those available?
There's audio copies, and the great thing about this crowd is that y'all are like me, and you can listen to something and be satisfied. We're old enough to where we don't have to have the visual element to feel like it matters. That said, one of the really wonderful things about doing this story about my dad was to find the stuff that they had in the seminary library, because it was him playing the piano. It was him doing Alfie, which, I guess I've made that clear. It was really strong, and it was really good. So you can get those. I think that there's probably a lot of audio stuff in the library, too. And then the family's got some. Not much of it is digital, so it would be hard to get a copy if anybody wanted any, but it wouldn't be impossible. Yes, sir.
I wonder how many people here came to one of the lay school theology programs that he did a 5 or 6 week session on the movies and theology
Thanks. It was a lot of fun to go to the movies with Dad. You know, the conversation on the way home to talk about when I started to get it. When I'm in college and law school to go see a movie, oh gosh, what did we see? Did anybody ever see the documentary film Crumb about the cartoonist, R. Crumb? It's a strange film. It was a great movie to get to see with Reverend Spong, or the Rev, as I called him. I mean, it was. See it and call me. I'll tell you what Dad said. Is that it? Thanks, y'all.
So here's a little something to make you remember us well. So, give them another applause. I'm John McFarland. I'm the chair of the committee that hosts this event, and I just wanted to welcome you again and hope that you'll keep us in mind for our other events. You'll be on our mailing list. For those of you who are on the committee, you might stand so you can be thanked for this meal. It's our job.